The Boy in Darkness by Mervyn Peake. Episode 4. The three of them, led by Hyena, had by now covered quite a tract of country. They had left the motionless woods behind them and had reached a belt of desiccated shrubs through which they waded. By now, the heat had gone out of the day, and the boy's hunger was causing him to cry. "What are his eyes doing, my dear?" said the goat, pointing as he did so with what looked like a handless arm, for the long semi-starched and dirty cuffs reached far beyond the hands and fingers. "Stop for a moment, Hyena love. What he is doing reminds me of something." "Oh, it does it, you son of a green stench? And what would that be, eh?" "Look and see for yourself, with your beautiful, clever face," said the goat. "Can you see what I mean? Turn your head to me, boy, so that your betters can enjoy the full of your countenance. You see, Hyena dear, is it not as I told you? His eyes are full of bits of broken glass. Feel them, Hyena, feel them. They are wet and warm. And look, both his cheeks are swimming with water. It reminds me of something. What is it?" "How should I know?" barked Hyena irritably. "Look," continued the goat. "I can stroke his eyelids. How the White Lord will love to readjust him." A vague, unformulated fear swept through the boy, though he could not understand what the goat meant by readjustment. Without knowing quite what he was doing, he struck out at the goat, but in his weakness and tiredness the blow was so feeble that though it landed on the shoulder of the goat, yet the creature felt nothing but went on talking. "Hyena dear! What, you hornhead? Can you remember far enough?" "Far enough what?" growled the hyena, his smooth paws working like clockwork. "Far enough back, my love," whispered the goat, scratching himself so that the dust poured out of his hide like smoke escaping from a chimney. "Far enough back," he repeated. The hyena shook his mane irritably. "Far enough back for what, you knobhead?" "For those long seasons. Those decades, dear, those centuries. Don't you remember? Before we were changed. When our limbs were beastless. We were, you know, my sweet hyena. We were, once." "We were what? Speak up, you damned goat, or I'll crack you like a rib." "We were different once. You had no mane on your sloping back. It is very beautiful, but it wasn't there. And your long forearms." "What about them?" "Well, they weren't always brindled, were they, dear?" Hyena spat a cloud of bone powder from between his powerful teeth. Then he leapt without warning at his colleague. "Silence!" he cried, in a voice that at any moment might have veered into that terrible, mournful cry which in turn might have let loose the diabolical laughter of the insane. Standing with one of its feet planted upon the goat, for Hyena had banged him to the ground. "Silence!" he cried again. "I do not want to remember." "Nor do I," said the goat. "But I can remember little things, curious little things, before we changed, you know." "I said silence," said the hyena. But this time there was something almost ruminative in the tone of his voice. "You are bruising my ribs," said Goat. "Have pity, my dear. You are too savage with your friends." "Oh, thank you, love. Bless me, you have a splendid... Look at the boy." "Bring him back," said Hyena, "and I'll skin him." "He is for our White Lord," said the goat. "I will cuff him." The boy had indeed wandered away, but only for a few yards. At the touch of the goat he sank to his knees as though he had been felled like a young tree. "I can remember quite a lot," said the goat, returning to Hyena. "I can remember when my brow was clear and smooth." "Who cares?" yelled Hyena in a fresh surge of temper. "Who cares about your bloody brow? I can tell you something else, said the goat. What's that? About this boy. What about him? He must not die before the White Lord sees him. Look at him, hyena. No, hyena dear, kicking him will not help. Perhaps he is dying. Pick him up, hyena. You are the noble one. You are the powerful one. Pick him up and gallop him to the mines. To the mines, my dear, while I race on ahead. What for? To have his supper ready. He must have bread and water, mustn't he? The hyena darted a mean and sidelong glance at the goat before it turned to the boy on the ground, and then, hardly stooping, caught him up in his brindled arms as though there were no weight at all. So they set off again, the goat trying to forge ahead, but he had not reckoned with the long, loping, sinewy run of his rival, whose voluminous white shirt billowed out behind. Sometimes it seemed that one of them was flagging and sometimes another, but for the most part they ran abreast. The boy was too far gone with exhaustion to understand what was happening. He did not even know that he was being held out at full length by hyena, rather as though he were a sacrifice. One advantage of this was that the odour of the powerful half-beast was to some extent mitigated, though it is doubtful whether the boy's state of collapse allowed this amelioration to be appreciated. Mile after mile they ran. The sea of shrubs through which they had waded for the last several miles had now given place to a thick kind of silvery rock face, over which the goat and the hyena ran as though they were part of some immemorial legend, their long, drawn-out shadows bounding beside them, while the sun slid down the sky in a blur of hueless light. And then, suddenly, as the dark thickened, they felt the first sign that the ground was dropping away, and that they had come to the great terraces that led downwards to the mines. And, sure enough, there it was, that widespread congregation of ancient and deserted chimneys, their edges glinting in the early moonlight. On seeing the chimneys, hyena and goat came to a halt. Why they did so is not hard to guess, for they were now as much in the presence of the Lamb as they would be standing before him. From now on, every single sound, no matter how faint, would be loud in the ears of their master. They both knew this by bitter experience, for in the far-off days they had, along with other half-men, made the mistake of whispering to one another, not realizing that the merest breath was sucked into the great flues and chimneys and so down to the central areas, where they turned and twisted, threading their way to where the Lamb sat upright, his ears and nostrils pricking with sentience. Masters in the art of deaf and dumb language and also of lip-reading, they chose the latter, for the dangling position of the goat's white cuffs obscured the fingers. So, staring one another in the face, they mouthed their words in deathly silence. "He knows we are here, hyena dear. He can smell us by now. And the boy. Of course. My stomach's turning over. I will go first with the boy and prepare his supper and his bed. You will not, you hornhead. Leave him to me, or I will crush you. Then I will go alone. Of course, you dust trap. He must be washed tonight, and fed, and given water. That is for you to do, since you insist. I will acquaint our master. Oh, my green loins, my loins, my terrified loins." They turned and withdrew from one another. Their lips ceased to move, but as they ended their conversation they brought their lips together, and in this sanctum the white lamb heard the sound of the cessation, a sound resembling that of a cobweb crumbling to the floor, or the step of a mouse on moss. And so the hyena went on alone, carrying the boy before him in his hands, until he came to the foot of a prodigious shaft, more like an abyss than anything consciously constructed. And here, on the edge of this great well of darkness, he knelt down, and, clasping his horrid hands together, he whispered, "White Lord of Midnight, hail!" The 5 words fell almost palpably down the throat of the herbless, lifeless shaft, and, echoing their way netherwards, came at last into the orbit of the lamb's reception. "It is Hyena, my lord! Hyena, whom you rescued from the upper void! Hyena, who came to you to love you and serve your purposes! Hail!" Then came a voice from the abysmal darkness. It was like a little bell tinkling, or the sound of naked innocence, or the crowning of a babe, or the bleating of a lamb.
"You have somebody with you, I believe,"
the little voice trilled out of the darkness. It had no need to be raised. Like a needle piercing its way through rotten fabric, so this sweet sound penetrated to the furthermost recesses of the underground kingdom. It reached, trill upon echoing trill, into the dungeons away to the west, where, among the twisted girders of red rust, the silent floors were noduled with a sea of purple mushrooms, dead as the ground they had once risen from. It needed but the stamp of a foot to bring them down in a great death of colourless dust. No foot, no gust of air, nothing had passed that way for 100 years. It penetrated in every direction, this voice of the lamb's, and now it spoke again.
"I am waiting for your answer, and for you."
Then, with a thin sigh like the sound of a scythe,
"What have you got for your lord? I am still waiting."
"We have a boy."
"A boy?"
"A boy, touchless." There was a long silence, during which Hyena thought he could hear something which he had never heard before, a remote throbbing. But the voice of the lamb was as clear and sweet and fresh as a water shoot, and quite emotionless.
"Where is the goat?"
"The goat," said Hyena, "has done everything to hinder me. Shall I come down, my lord?"
"I think that what I said was, where is the goat? I am not interested in whether or not he hinders you, or you hinder him. What interests me at this moment is his whereabouts. Wait! Do I hear him in the southern gallery?"
"Yes, master," said the hyena. He thrust his head and shoulders so far over the edge of the abyss that it would seem dangerous to anyone unacquainted with his miraculous head for heights and his general agility in dark and precipitous places. "Yes, master. The goat is descending by the iron staircase. He has gone to prepare the boy his bread and water. The hairless thing has fainted. You would not wish to see him, my white lord, not until he has been washed, fed, and rested. Nor do you want to see the goat. That stupid crackhead. I will not allow him to irk you."
"You are strangely kind today,"
came the sweet voice from the depths.
"So I am sure you will do what I tell you. For if you do otherwise, I shall have your black mane burnt away. So come at once with your exhausted friend, and I will size him up." I can smell him already, and I must say he is like a breath of fresh air in this place. Are you on your way? I don't hear anything.
The lamb had bared its pearly teeth. "I am on my way, master, on my way," cried the hyena, who was shaking with fear, for the lamb's voice was like a knife in a velvet sheath. "I will bring him to you now to be yours forever." And Hyena, his legs and arms still trembling in spite of all their strength, began to lower himself and the boy over the edge of the pit, where a chain shone dimly in the moonlight. In order to have both hands free for swarming down the iron chain, Hyena had slung the boy over his shoulder, where he moaned pitifully. But Hyena cared nothing about this, for he had recognized a note of a different blend in the lamb's voice. He still spoke as gently, as horribly gently as before, but there was a difference now. What it was exactly that gave Hyena the impression that the voice had altered, it is impossible to say, for Hyena could only feel the change, and the feel of it was that of hidden fervour. Indeed, what cause there was! Any creature of lesser calibre than the lamb would by now have been unable to control the horrid thrills of his excitement. For a decade or more had passed since the last visitor sat down at table with him, sat down and saw the veiled eyes of the lamb, and knew even as he stared at his host that his soul was being sucked out of him. He had died, like the rest, the brain running away too sharply from the body, or the body leaping like a frog in search of the brain, so that they broke apart, and, like the machinery of the mines, they died away into silence and emptiness of death. What it was that kept the last two underlings alive, even the lamb did not know. Something of their natures, or in their organs, gave the goat and the hyena some sort of physical immunity. Something perhaps to do with their general coarseness of soul and fibre. They had outlived 100 powerful beasts whose metamorphoses had in time destroyed them from within. The lion, only an age ago, had collapsed in a mockery of power, bending his great head as he did so, the tears welling from the amber eyes to thread their way down tracts of golden cheekbone. It was a great and terrible fall, yet it was merciful, for under the macabre aegis of the dazzling lamb, the one-time king of beasts was brought to degradation, and there is nothing more foul than the draining of the heart's blood drop by drop from the great golden cat. Collapsing with a roar, it had, so it seemed, dragged down the night, as though it were a curtain, and when the lanterns had been lit again there was nothing there but a cloak and breastplate and a dagger bright with stars, and, floating away into the unutterable darkness of the western vaults, the mane of the great half-beast, like an aura. And there had been the man, delicate and nimble, across whose face the lamb had drawn his finger, so that he knew, in his blindness, by touch and a quivering in the air, that he was pure gazelle. But he had died a century after, at the exquisite height of a bound, his great eyes losing lustre as he fell. And there had been the mantis man, the pig man, and the dogs, the crocodile, the raven, and the inordinate fish that sang like a linnet. But they had all died at one stage or another in their transmutation for lack of some ingredient, some necessity for survival, which for some obscure reason hyena and the goat possessed. It was a source of chagrin to the lamb that of all the divers creatures to have passed through his tiny snow-white hands, creatures of all shapes, sizes, and intellects, he should find himself left at last with a couple of near idiots, the cowardly and bullying hyena and the sycophantic goat. There was a time when his secret vault, with its rich carpets, golden candlesticks, incense burning in beakers of jade, and its crimson awnings swaying a little from the distant updrafts of the air shafts, there was a time when this sanctum had been filled with his hierophants, who, awestruck at the sight of such a place, peered over one another's shoulders. Shoulders of fur, shoulders of bristle, shoulders of raw hide, shoulders of scale and feather, at their lord, while he, the Lamb, the creator, as it were, of a new kingdom, a new species, sat on his high-backed throne, the dull blue membrane covering his eyes, his breast sumptuous with soft and peerless curls, his hands folded, his faintly tinctured lips the most delicate of mauves, and on his head, on rare occasions, a crown of delicate bones exquisitely interwoven, bleached to a whiteness that rivaled the very wool that was his raiment. This crown was constructed from the thin bones of a stoat, and indeed it seemed that something of the stoat's mercurial and terrible vitality had remained in the marrow of the filigree structure. For when the Lamb, out of the diabolical hell of its heart, discovered his own heinous power to hold a victim rooted to the ground, so that the blood within the creature yearned for annihilation at the hands of the torturer, the heart pounding against its will, then was it like the swaying stoat, with its upright carriage and its kiss of death upon the jugular. And indeed the goat had seen it in the Lamb, and the hyena also, that mesmeric swaying, that upright back, all but the kiss of death, all but the jugular. For the white Lamb was not interested in corpses, though they filled the darkness with their bones, but only in playthings. And all he had left was the hyena and the goat, yet he still held court. He was still the lord of the mines, though it was a great length of time since he had worn the crown, for he had given up hope of new victims. Year after year, decade after decade, in this subterranean world of silence and of death, nothing had stirred, nothing had moved, not even the dust. Nothing but their voices from time to time, when the goat or hyena reported at close of day, recounting to the Lamb the tale of each day's search. Search, fruitless search. That was the burden of their lives. That was their purpose. To find another human, for the Lamb itched for his talents to burgeon once again. For he was like a pianist manacled, the keyboard before him, or a famished gourmet, unable to reach out, but able to see a table spread with delicacies. But all this was over, and the Lamb, though he made no sign, and though his voice was so smooth and even as oil on water, was consumed with an exquisite apprehension, quite terrible in its intensity. The Lamb could hear two voices, one of them proceeding from the gigantic funnel to the north, and the other a good mile further to the east, much fainter but perfectly clear, a kind of obsequious shuffling. The other noise was altogether more imminent, and was of course proceeding from the nearby shaft, where Hyena lowered himself link by link through the darkness with the boy slung over his hirsute shoulders. As he descended, 3 sounds preceded him. The grinding and straining of the iron links, a slow panting in the beast's capacious chest, and the munching of small bones. The Lamb, in his sanctum, alone save for the loudening sound of his henchmen, sat very upright. Though his eyes were veiled and sightless, yet his entire face had something about it that was watchful. The head was not cocked upon one side, the ears were not pricked. There was no quivering to be seen, no tension, yet never was a creature as alert, as vile, as predatory. Cold horror was returning to the sanctum. the throbbing horror of the will, for the scent in the nostrils of the lamb had by now become more specific. The field of odour had narrowed, and it was now no longer a matter of conjecture as to what it was that the lamb could soon be touching with his soft white hand. He would be touching nothing less than flesh entirely human. He could not as yet determine such niceties as the age of the captive, for he was shrouded in the fumes of iron that spread from the long chain, and the smell of earth through which the wellhead had been bored, not to speak of the indescribable effluvia of the hyena, and 100 other emanations. But with every yard of descent, these varying odours detached themselves one from another, and there came the moment when, with absolute surety, Hyena knew that there was a boy in the shaft. A boy in the shaft. A boy from the other region, approaching, descending. This in itself was enough to cause the very girders of the mines to coil and spill red dust like sand. It was enough to start exciting echoes unparented. Echoes that cried like demons. Echoes at large like ears among the shadows. Echoes of consternation. Echoes delirious. Echoes barbaric. Echoes of exultation. For the world had forsaken the mines, and time had forgotten them. Yet here was the world again, the globe in microcosm. A human. A boy. Something to break, or to batter down, as though it were clay, and then to build again. Meanwhile, as the moments passed, and the hyena and the boy drew nearer and nearer to the sumptuous vault below them where the lamb sat immobile as a marble carving, save only for the flickering of his dilated nostrils, the goat, away to the west, had reached the wide and empty floor of the mines and was shuffling along in that horrible sideways gait of his, the left shoulder always in advance of the rest of his body. And as he made his furtive way, he muttered to himself, for he was full of grievance. What right had Hyena to have all the credit? Why should Hyena make the presentation? It had been he, the goat, who had found the human. It was bitterly unfair. A hotness of anger burned like live coal beneath his ribs. The cuffs on his jacket shook, and his tombstone teeth were displayed in what could be taken either for a grin or a threat. In fact, it was a sign of frustration and hatred, a rankling hatred, for this was a moment never again to be repeated, a moment of such dramatic importance to the three of them that there should have been no question of rivalry for favour. Could they not have approached their emperor, the lamb, together? Could they not have held the prisoner one either side, and made their bow together, and offered him together? Oh, it was most unjust, and the goat beat his hands together at his sides, and a nasty sweat poured down his long face on the damp bristles through which his yellow eyes shone pale coins. So strongly did he feel all this that he now began unconsciously to think of the boy almost as a brother in distress, someone who, because of his hatred for Hyena, and this had been obvious from the first moment, had become automatically and by pure retaliation an ally. But there was nothing he could do in his pent-up condition, save make his way towards the vault some short way from which in his own dank quarters he would, as a gesture or a slap in Hyena's face, he would prepare his own bed for the boy, and stave his hunger and thirst with water and sour bread. It was obvious that the boy's need for sleep and sustenance outweighed any other factor, for what possible advantage could there be to the lamb to see the thing he had been waiting for so many years in a state of collapse? He would wish for an alert and sentient prey. and it was the goat's plan to put this point to the lamb himself. It was therefore a matter of great moment that the goat should make all speed to the sumptuous sanctum of the lamb, and he began to run as he had never run before. On every side of him, above him and sometimes below him, the derelict remains of iron structures spread out their wild and subterranean arms. Brandished in giant loops, coiled in twisted stairways that led to nowhere, these relics of another age unfurled their iron fantasies as goats sped by, covering the ground with quite unnatural pace. It was very dark, but he knew the track of old, and never by so much as a touch did he disturb a fragment of the litter that lay scattered on the wide floor. He knew it as an Indian knows the secret track through the woods, and, like the Indian, he was ignorant of the great fastness that lay on either side. There came a time when the ground descended in a slow slope, and the goat, still running edgeways on as though all hell was after him, came to the outskirts of that central dereliction, where, in his vault, the white lamb sat and waited.